December 20th, 1941, 4 a.m. The White House, Washington, D.C. Secretary of the Navy, Frank Knox, sits across from President Franklin D. Roosevelt in the Oval Office. The room smells of cigarette smoke and old wood. Maps of the Pacific Ocean are spread across the desk. Red pins mark the terrible events of the last 13 days. The attack on Pearl Harbor and the fall of Wake Island. America is at war, and the situation looks very serious. Guam is gone. The Philippines are under attack. Enemy forces are closing in from every side. The strongest navy in American history is now struggling. Ships have been sunk. Bases have fallen. Sailors are missing. What once looked powerful and unbeatable now looks shocked and wounded. News keeps getting worse. Each report brings another loss. People in Washington are worried. Military leaders feel the pressure. The country is afraid, but also angry. The man who was supposed to be in charge of the Navy, Admiral Harold R. Stark, is blamed for the disaster. Many believe he failed to prepare the fleet for what was coming. Confidence in him is gone. In government offices and military headquarters, people whisper the same thing. His career is over. He will not survive this crisis. Everyone knows it. Admiral Harold R. Stark did not pick up the telephone on December 7th to warn Admiral Husband Kimmel that war was about to begin. Many believe that one missed call changed everything. Years later, Dwight D. Eisenhower would describe Stark as just a nice old lady, meaning he was kind but not strong enough for such a dangerous moment. President Franklin D. Roosevelt knows he needs new leadership in the Navy. The country is at war. There is no time for weakness or doubt. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox already has someone in mind. The choice seems obvious. The Navy now needs a strong and confident leader, someone who can rebuild trust with allies, someone who can work closely with the British, someone who can calm a frightened American public. Most importantly, the new leader must cooperate smoothly with General George C. Marshall and the Army. The war will require teamwork at the highest level. The future of the Navy depends on this decision. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz seems perfect for the job. He is calm, polite, and extremely intelligent. He looks more like a retired banker than a war commander. But behind that quiet face is a sharp and strategic mind. He plans battles the way a chess master plans moves, always thinking several steps ahead. The British would like him immediately. His respectful and diplomatic style would make cooperation easy. General George C. Marshall would respect his professionalism. Congress would trust him. The American people would feel safer knowing someone steady was in charge. Everything about the situation suggests that the Navy needs a calm and careful leader, someone who can rebuild strength, someone who can work closely with allies, someone who can hold the alliance together while America prepares for a long war. Secretary of the Navy Frank Knox suggests one name: Ernest King. President Franklin D. Roosevelt does not hesitate. That afternoon, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signs Executive Order 8984. Ernest Joseph King, 63 years old, is named Commander-in-Chief of the United States Fleet. He is given powers that no other American naval officer has held before or since. Those who know King are shocked. His own daughter once called him the most even-tempered man in the Navy because he is always angry. Commander Hugh Rodman even tried to have him dismissed for insubordination. In the fleet, his reputation is so bad that officers cringe when his name is mentioned. King drinks heavily. He fights with almost everyone. He once returned an urgent wartime letter from General Henry H. Arnold unopened because it was addressed to Rear Admiral King instead of Admiral King. By all accounts, he is the most difficult, abrasive, and confrontational officer in the entire U.S. military. Even General Ismay, Chief of Staff to Winston Churchill, notices his fiery reputation. General Ismay, Churchill's Chief of Staff, would later describe King as blunt and standoffish, almost rude at times. He was intolerant, quick to anger, and deeply suspicious of anything British. Despite all this, King's skill, determination, and fierce leadership made him exactly the kind of commander the Navy needed during the war. Years later, Dwight D. Eisenhower would write in his diary that one thing that might help win the war would be to get someone to shoot King. Yet President Franklin D. Roosevelt had just given this man control of the largest navy on Earth. At the time, no one, neither Eisenhower, Churchill, nor anyone else, understood the full significance of Roosevelt's decision. It was not a mistake. It was the single most important personnel choice of the entire war. Within just 3 years, Ernest J. King will completely transform the United States Navy. What was once a stunned, demoralized force will become the most powerful fleet in human history. He will push forward the battle for Guadalcanal, creating a campaign against the objections of both the Army and his fellow Navy officers. He will design the dual-axis strategy in the Pacific, striking Japan's empire from 2 directions at once. King will champion the submarine campaign that sinks over 1,100 Japanese merchant ships, crippling Japan's economy and bringing it to collapse. And he will do all of this while constantly clashing with the British, the Army, General Douglas MacArthur, and nearly everyone who crosses his path. This is the story of how the most hated man in the American military became its most indispensable leader. It is the story of how President Franklin D. Roosevelt chose fury over diplomacy, and how one admiral's ungovernable personality won a 2-ocean war. To understand why Roosevelt chose King, you first have to understand what he was like before Pearl Harbor. By 1939, he was a man whose career seemed to be over, but the war would reveal what he was truly capable of. Ernest J. King was born on November 23, 1878, in Lorain, Ohio. His father was a Scottish immigrant who worked on the railways, and his mother, from England, ran a strict Calvinist household. As a boy, King was inspired by an article in a magazine called Youth's Companion. Determined to join the Navy, he secured a congressional appointment and entered the United States Naval Academy in 1897. He graduated fourth in a class of 67 in 1901 and immediately began building what would become one of the most varied careers in American naval history. King served on battleships during the aftermath of the Spanish-American War, commanded destroyers in the Atlantic, and ran submarines at the New London Submarine Base from 1923 to 1926. While in command of submarines, he personally directed the dangerous salvage operations of the sunken submarines S-51 and S-4 in the freezing North Atlantic. These daring rescues put his life at risk alongside his divers, and he earned 2 Distinguished Service Medals for his bravery. At the age of 46, King achieved another remarkable milestone. He qualified as a naval aviator at Pensacola, proving his skill and versatility across multiple naval disciplines. King's decision to become a naval aviator was a bold gamble, driven by the Navy's new rule that aircraft carrier captains must hold pilot wings. He went on to captain the aircraft carrier USS Lexington CV-2 from 1930 to 1932, and later served as Chief of the Bureau of Aeronautics from 1933 to 1936. By the late 1930s, King had commanded surface ships, submarines, and aircraft carriers, a rare achievement. No other senior admiral in the Navy could match that combination. Through careful planning and deliberate ambition, he had mastered nearly every aspect of naval warfare. Yet his personality often undermined his talents. King was a notorious womanizer, rumored to be a garter snatcher at dinner parties aboard the Lexington. His fiery temper was legendary. His right hand, according to stories, was more sunburned than his left from shaking his fist at pilots through the open bridge window. He made enemies compulsively and never apologized for it, leaving a trail of resentment even as his skill and experience grew. In 1939, President Franklin D. Roosevelt passed over Ernest Joseph King for Chief of Naval Operations, choosing the genial Admiral Harold R. Stark instead. King reverted to his permanent rank of Rear Admiral and was assigned to the General Board, the Navy's so-called Elephant's Graveyard, where senior officers spent their final years before retirement. His friends blamed his drinking and temper. At 60, it seemed King's naval career and any chance at war was over before it even began. Then, in December 1940, Stark pulled his old friend off the shelf and gave him command of the Atlantic Patrol Force. By February 1941, King was overseeing the undeclared naval war against German U-boats in the North Atlantic, operating under his personal motto, "Do all that we can with what we have." In August 1941, the Atlantic Charter Conference aboard King's flagship, USS Augusta, CA-31, gave Roosevelt a close view of King's commanding presence. 4 months later, Pearl Harbor made that exposure decisive. Roosevelt and King had known each other for decades.
Historian David Conan documented that their history stretched back to the Great White Fleet days around 1908. These men had 4 decades of experience with each other before reaching high command. Roosevelt saw something in King that others missed. Behind his rage was a mind that thought in oceans, strategic, far-reaching, and uncompromising. Yet King's first crisis as Supreme Commander became his most damning failure.
In January 1942, Admiral Karl Donitz launched Operation Drumbeat, sending German U-boats to attack merchant shipping along the American East Coast. The result was a disaster that the Germans called the Second Happy Time. The numbers were staggering. In the first 6 months of 1942, U-boats sank about 397 ships, totaling over 2 million tons, and roughly 5,000 people lost their lives. German submarines surfaced at night near cities like New York, Miami, and Atlantic City, using the coastal lights to spot merchant ships like targets in a shooting gallery. Submarine Commander Peter Kramer described the ships as presented on a plate against the glare of a carefree new world. The British had already learned that convoys were the only effective defense. First Sea Lord Dudley Pound cabled Admiral Ernest J. King, urging immediate convoy implementation and offering 24 Royal Navy destroyers and corvettes. King resisted. He argued that poorly escorted convoys could be worse than none. An unescorted ship was harder for submarines to find than a grouped convoy. At the time, the Navy had only 20 vessels and 103 aircraft to defend 1,500 miles of coastline. King insisted that his destroyers were needed to protect troop transports heading to Europe. By the end of 1942, not a single troop transport had been lost under his protection. The first organized coastal convoy did not sail until May 14, 1942, 5 months after the U-boat attacks had begun. The results were immediate and dramatic. In the 3 months after convoys were fully implemented, 1,400 ships were escorted, and only 3 were sunk. Official naval historian Samuel Eliot Morison wrote bluntly that the United States Navy had been woefully unprepared for the U-boat blitz, and that much of this failure was the Navy's own fault. King eventually acknowledged the reality. In a June 1942 letter to General George C. Marshall, he wrote that escorting convoys was not just one way to handle the submarine threat, it was the only way that offered any hope of success. By May 1943, King created the 10th Fleet, a paper fleet of about 50 people with no ships of its own, but full authority to direct any naval assets against U-boats. He commanded it personally. That month alone, 41 U-boats were destroyed, permanently turning the tide in the Battle of the Atlantic. The convoy disaster was real, and King bore significant responsibility. But it was not the full measure of the man. While merchant ships burned along the American coast, King was simultaneously building the strategic architecture that would destroy the Japanese Empire. His conflicts with the British reached their peak during the Great Allied Conferences of 1943 and 1944, where his fiery personality clashed with allies even as he planned victory on a global scale.
To understand why Ernest J. King had so much power in the Allied war rooms, it helps to see the scope of his authority. On March 12, 1942, President Franklin D. Roosevelt signed Executive Order 9096, which merged the roles of Commander-in-Chief, United States Fleet, and Chief of Naval Operations into a single command held solely by King. Historian Thomas Buell called it one of the most remarkable documents of World War II. This order gave King operational command over every fighting ship and administrative control over the entire Navy Department. The word direction was added at the last minute, giving him authority over the Navy's complex feudal-style bureau system, power that even Secretary Frank Knox had not anticipated. Combined with his seat on the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the Combined Chiefs of Staff, King became the most powerful naval officer in U.S. history. He wielded this power fiercely. At the Casablanca Conference in January 1943, King fought hard for Pacific resources against the Europe First strategy. Months earlier, he had written to Roosevelt that no fighter ever won his fight by covering up, by merely fending off the other fellow's blows. The winner hits and keeps on hitting. King argued the Pacific deserved 30% of Allied resources but was receiving only 15%. Field Marshal Alan Brooke described King in his diary as shrewd but somewhat swollen-headed, with a vision focused mainly on the Pacific. At the Cairo Conference in November 1943, confrontations between King and Brooke turned almost physical. Lieutenant General Joseph Stilwell watched them clash and wrote in his diary that Brooke got nasty and King got good and sore, nearly climbing over the table at Brooke. Stillwell admitted he wished King had socked him. King's forceful personality and unprecedented authority made him both feared and essential, an officer who would not back down, even in front of the highest Allied leaders.
King's attitude toward the British came from strategic conviction, not personal prejudice. In November 1943, he wrote to Admiral Harold R. Stark that the seeming helplessness of their British cousins was sometimes amusing, sometimes annoying. He joked that he was sure what they secretly wished was for America to haul down the Stars and Stripes and raise the white ensign on all U.S. ships. Field Marshal John Dill gave a more nuanced assessment. When an RAF officer called King anti-British, Dill corrected him. King was pro-American, not anti-British. Dill admitted he had a sneaking respect for King, but noted that King did not trust the British a single yard. King's rivalry with General Douglas MacArthur was both structural and deeply personal. King held MacArthur in low regard. When he conceived the Guadalcanal operation after Midway, he essentially ordered it without consulting the Joint Chiefs. MacArthur called it a perfidious Navy plot. King's response was blunt: "My ships, my Marines, my operation." General George C. Marshall brokered a compromise by shifting the command boundary 1 degree west, but the fundamental tension persisted throughout the war. The great 1944 debate over whether to invade Formosa or the Philippines highlighted their conflict. King favored Formosa as the most direct route to Japan, while MacArthur insisted on liberating the Philippines for reasons of national honor. President Franklin Delano Roosevelt ultimately sided with MacArthur. King's relationship with Marshall was of grudging professional respect, mostly conducted through written memos even though their offices were in adjacent buildings. Their sharpest clash came in July 1942, when the British vetoed the cross-channel invasion. Marshall and King jointly proposed to Roosevelt that if the British insisted on North Africa, The United States should redirect all efforts to the Pacific. Roosevelt rejected the proposal with a handwritten note using his rarely invoked title. "Your proposal is hereby rejected." Signed, Franklin Delano Roosevelt, Commander-in-Chief. King's strategic mind, fierce independence, and unyielding personality shaped every decision, earning both admiration and exasperation from allies and rivals alike.
Through all of this, President Franklin D. Roosevelt never wavered in his support of Ernest Joseph Enck, E.J. King. He described King as very undiplomatic, especially when the admiral reached his low boiling point. Yet Roosevelt understood that King's combative nature created a valuable negotiating dynamic. King fought fiercely for American interests, making Roosevelt appear reasonable in comparison. King's aggression was genuine, not performative, and that made it effective. When King turned 64 in November 1942, reaching the mandatory retirement age, he sent Roosevelt a formal notification. Roosevelt handwritten a reply directly on the letter. "So what, old top? I may even send you a birthday present," and mailed it back. The results of King's leadership are clear in the numbers. The Guadalcanal campaign, which King forced into existence against nearly universal opposition, began on August 7, 1942, becoming the first major Allied ground offensive of the war. Over 6 months of brutal fighting, Japan lost 24 major warships, roughly 800 aircraft, and over 30,000 soldiers. The United States Naval Institute assessment is unequivocal. Without King's determination, there would have been no Guadalcanal campaign. Japan permanently lost the strategic initiative and never regained it. The dual-axis strategy King championed at the Casablanca and Trident conferences kept Japan divided and unable to concentrate its forces. Admiral Chester W. Nimitz advanced through the Central Pacific, capturing the Gilbert Islands in November 1943, the Marshall Islands in January 1944, and the Marianas by June 1944, bringing Japan within range of B-29 bombers, which would eventually devastate its cities. King's strategic vision, relentless drive, and willingness to clash with allies and rivals alike reshaped the Pacific War and ensured America's naval supremacy. General Douglas MacArthur advanced through the Southwest Pacific along a complementary axis. Together, these two drives produced the Battle of the Philippine Sea, which destroyed Japanese carrier aviation, and the Battle of Leyte Gulf, the largest naval battle in history. The submarine campaign that King championed was perhaps the most cost-effective military operation of the 20th century. American submarines sank 113 Japanese merchant ships, totaling nearly 4.88 million tons, along with 201 warships, including a battleship, 8 carriers, and 11 cruisers. These submarines were responsible for 56% of Japan's total merchant marine losses. Japan's merchant fleet shrank from 6.4 million tons in December 1941 to less than 1.5 million tons by the end of the war. The submarine force never exceeded 50,000 officers and men, only about 1.6% of the Navy, yet it suffered a 22% casualty rate, the highest of any American military branch. Under King's leadership, the United States Navy grew from 337,000 personnel and roughly 350 major combatant ships in December 1941 to over 3.3 million personnel and 6,768 ships by August 1945. The expanded fleet included 28 fleet carriers, 71 escort carriers, 23 battleships, and 232 submarines, giving the U.S. Navy control of over 70% of the world's total naval tonnage. None of those carriers existed when King first took command. On August 14, 1945, King sent his final wartime message to Admiral Chester W. Nimitz: "Suspend all offensive action. Remain alert." Then he turned to an aide and quietly said, "Well, it is all over. I wonder what I'm going to do tomorrow." King's combination of vision, ruthlessness, and relentless drive had reshaped the Navy, won a two-ocean war, and left a legacy unmatched in American naval history.
Admiral Andrew Cunningham, Britain's most celebrated wartime sailor, delivered perhaps the fairest verdict on the man who had tormented his countrymen for 4 years. He said that, on the whole, Ernest King was the right man in the right place. He was not a good cooperator, Cunningham noted, but he was a man of immense capacity and ability, ruthless in his methods. King died on June 25, 1956, at the Naval Hospital in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, at the age of 77. He was buried at the United States Naval Academy Cemetery in Annapolis, Maryland. The Navy honored him by naming a destroyer leader, DLG-10, later redesignated as a cruiser, after him. Even after the war, King's combative nature persisted. Secretary of the Navy James Forrestal once told a senator that King had the brains, but that he hated his guts. King's reply was characteristically blunt. He hated Forrestal's guts too. Even in death, the man could not stop fighting. President Franklin D. Roosevelt never explained his choice of King in any single document. He did not need to. The proof was in the Pacific itself, transformed in less than 4 years from a Japanese-controlled lake into an American highway. Roosevelt understood something that even George C. Marshall, Dwight Eisenhower, Winston Churchill, and Alan Brooke never fully accepted. In the darkest hours of the war, when everything seemed to be burning and nothing was certain, the United States Navy did not need diplomacy, politeness, or compromise. It needed Ernest King.